The Spanish flu pandemic turned the tides in favor of the Allies, and it probably shortened World War I. This is the science and geopolitics analysis of the 1918 Spanish flu that brought World War I to an end. Stay tuned until the end of the video, where I'll analyze Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the possible role COVID-19 will play. It's been 104 years since we've seen a war and epidemic coincide on this scale, so you don't want to miss the analysis. But first, some crucial background info on World War I. The early 20th century saw conflict on a global scale witness the assassination of one Austrian archduke that set off a chain reaction. The domino effect impelled the European powers, their colonies, and their allies into total war. The First World War started in 1914. Following the onslaught, near worldwide turmoil, violence, and attrition dragged on until 1918, killing 20 million. The Allies won, and in 1919 they unilaterally created a new international order. The infamous Treaty of Versailles dissolved Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and it also controversially forced Germany to accept responsibility for the war. This fateful clause set the stage for the emergence of Nazi Germany, leading to World War II. While today's history books cover the world wars in depth, they tend to gloss over an even deadlier conflict. This conflict was between human and pathogen, the 1918 Spanish flu. The airborne viral pandemic occurred in 4 waves. The first was in 1918 during the war, but the disease maintained pandemic status well into 1920. The Spanish flu had a shocking death toll of 50 to 100 million people, more than any 20th century war. It killed more people than World War I or World War II, and according to the highest estimates, both combined. The symptoms were brutal. For example, heliotrope cyanosis is a light purple skin discoloration resulting from suffocation after the lungs flood with blood and fluids. People's lungs flooded because the immune system fought so hard that it destroyed lung membranes. The cause of this phenomenon is cytokine storms. Cytokine storms are when the immune system kicks into overdrive. Young people with strong immune systems were the most vulnerable, so adolescents and young adults died at very high rates from the Spanish flu. For a more detailed breakdown of flu virology, check out my other video in the description below. Young people were the age group most involved in the war effort. Soldiers acted as a vector for influenza, spreading it from the battlefield to the civilian population in Europe. This video is about why the Spanish flu had a tremendous influence on World War I, but the inverse is true. The flu wouldn't have been the same without the war. Even the name Spanish flu had its origins in wartime propaganda. Spain was neutral, so the Spanish press didn't have to downplay the epidemic to keep morale high. Widely reported cases of Spanish royalty contracting the disease led to the public misconception that Spain was ground zero. Scientists don't know the precise origin, but there's no compelling evidence that it was Spain. Yet regardless of the ground zero location, experts agree that the virus started in aquatic birds, where it mutated and spread to humans. After the zoonotic transfer event, the flu wreaked havoc on the world, and it profoundly affected World War I. Here are 3 competing theories about what happened in 1918. The first theory: the flu affected the Central Powers worse than the Allies. So according to this theory from the prominent historian Andrew Price Smith, the flu wasn't equally bad everywhere. Instead, it put Germany and Austria at a disadvantage. Their troops got it sooner and more severely. The evidence for this theory hinges on records of very early cases in Austria-Hungary. This evidence points to the region as a possible ground zero. These records from Austria-Hungary weren't widely known before the late 2000s, so before then, historians mostly believed that the flu added fuel to the fire with no discernible impact on the war. Which brings us to theory 2, fuel on the fire. In his 2003 book, historian Alfred W. Crosby describes the war and pandemic as inherently chaotic, virtually impossible to analyze with accuracy. Quote, The pandemic affected history in general in the way that the random addition of a poison to some of the refreshments served at the 1918 West Point commencement celebrations would have affected the military history of World War II. That is, it had enormous influence, but one that utterly evades logical analysis and that has been completely ignored by all commentators in the past. It had little influence on the course of political and military struggles because it usually affected all sides equally. This historian has a point about the limitations of our knowledge, so I kept these limitations in mind when I made my own theory. Take it with a grain of salt. Theory number 3 from yours truly. The flu broke the stalemate. Prior to 1918, the Western Front was in a virtual stalemate. The nature of trench warfare made defensive battle tactics relatively effective, while offensive maneuvers were difficult. One reason for this was the trenches. They were huge fortified defensive structures. Also, the newly invented machine guns allowed soldiers to fire indiscriminately at anyone advancing from the other side. No precise aim necessary. World War I was a war of attrition, and that's why the Western Front was at a standstill. However, in 1918, there was an influx of American troops, but the increase in numbers wasn't enough to quickly beat the Germans. The Allies could increase their offensive capabilities with their advantage in numbers, but their higher manpower did almost nothing to weaken the other side's defenses. Instead, disease weakened German defenses. That's why the Allies could make meaningful advances. It's why the Central Powers were forced to surrender. In the absence of effective medical equipment, masks, and vaccines, an army can only cope with terrible disease by having huge personnel and reserves to throw at the front lines, and that's exactly what the Allies did. Now, could it be that the Austrians and Germans got hit with the flu first, like Theory 1 stipulates? Absolutely. But my point still stands. The flu broke the stalemate, and it probably shortened the war by many months. As for the fuel on the fire theory, I agree that the problem is complicated, but that doesn't mean we can't pin down specific ways the flu changed the war's outcome. When I talk about the outcome, I'm not just talking about who won, I'm also talking about the aftermath. In 1919, US President Woodrow Wilson became ill with the third wave when negotiating the Treaty of Versailles. His illness depleted his energy, and despite his desire for a fair compromise, he was not effective at standing up to the French and British who sought to punish Germany. As a result, harsh German World War I reparations sustained economic hardship. Germany paid its final World War I reparation installment of $94 million in October 2010. Think about that for a moment. The sheer scale of these reparations was debilitating and long-lasting, and in the short term, they helped create a perfect storm leading to the Great Depression. Furthermore, German humiliation on the world stage rallied support for the Nazi Party, leading to World War II. The Great Depression, the Nazi Party, and World War II would have been unimaginable to our ancestors 100 years ago. So today, can we predict what will happen in Ukraine and whether COVID-19 will have anything to do with it? Well, we can try. One thing we can rule out is an exact repeat of what happened on the front lines in 1918. The type of warfare in Ukraine today is radically different from World War I. It's defined by the heavy use of artillery and other modern battle tactics. Also, COVID-19 is far less likely than the Spanish flu to cause serious illness or death among young adults of fighting age. That said, COVID-19 almost certainly played a role in the lead-up to the war. For example, Vladimir Putin's isolation, possibly related to quarantine, could have influenced his decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as opposed to a smaller-scale annexation like we saw in 2014 in Crimea, or no invasion at all. He may have rationalized to himself that the West would not come together with economic sanctions against Russia, and without crucial access to advisors, he became extremely overzealous. I don't believe any flare-up of COVID-19 will influence the outcome of battles or the eventual winner of the war, But COVID-19 has done a lot more than make people sick. Stimulus, quantitative easing, and other fiscal policies have led to inflationary pressures before the war was on anyone's mind. But we're also seeing unprecedented sanctions on Russia, which is a tremendous resource exporter, plus challenges exporting resources from Ukraine, which is also a major resource exporter. We've already seen the inflationary effects of oil and gas sanctions, and this energy-related inflation compounds the inflationary pressures arising from COVID. But it's worth noting there was also huge inflation in the wake of the Spanish flu, largely due to high consumer demand, a labor shortage, and wage hikes. Today is an echo of 100 years ago, amplified by disrupted global supply chains, the war in resource-rich Ukraine, and Western sanctions against Russia. Obviously, some countries will be hit harder than others, and we're seeing a strengthening US dollar. As for the recession, it is precedented. In 1920 to 21, following the inflationary period, the US and UK experienced a sharp deflationary recession. It was unclear what aspects of the recession were attributable to the war and what parts came from a natural pandemic recovery. I suspect many parts of Europe will have similar recessions with multiple causes traceable to COVID-19 fiscal stimulus, inflation, high interest rates, and the war in Ukraine. As central banks tighten fiscal policy, many countries will see inflation decrease, but it's unlikely that we'll have large-scale deflationary recessions like we had in 1920 to 21. Obviously, we're no longer on the gold standard, and that could have been a contributing factor back then, allowing deflation to happen in the first place and be a significant problem. Regardless, the Russo-Ukrainian war will have rippling effects on the world, and they will come at a very inopportune time. Not that there's ever a good time, but pandemic recovery and the ongoing cases as of my posting this video don't make it any easier for the world to deal with the issues. My hope is that we can use this precedent to try to stoke something resembling the Roaring Twenties. I know that may sound tremendously optimistic, but it would have sounded optimistic for anyone to say that there was a decade of prosperity coming. Imagine if you were in the 1920 to 21 recession and you had just experienced, like many of your male friends were just coming home from the war, and everyone was recovering from Spanish flu, which had killed a lot of young people. That would be ludicrous to imagine that you're going to have some prosperous years ahead of you, but it was true. And while we're going to have a different version of what happened back then, my hope is that it can be a prosperous version. I have high hopes that people can respond individually and as groups, and hopefully make the best of what has so far been a less than ideal situation. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the Science and Geopolitics channel, and if you're not yet interested in science and geopolitics, subscribe for the other S and G, if you know what I mean, because you might become interested. If you are interested already, then go ahead and click the notification bell so that you can have thought-provoking content in your notification bar every Wednesday.